The cowboy stopped laughing the moment the cursed court bride touched the wild black horse. A boot slammed against the rodeo gate as the black mustang reared high into the cold Colorado air, foam dripping from its mouth. Men backed away fast. Then the bride everyone mocked stepped through the red dust in a faded blue dress, her hands trembling while the horse screamed and struck the dirt. Ethan felt the winter wind cut through his coat when she whispered something under her breath, and the animal suddenly froze still. What she did next made the entire arena go silent. Would you trust her or run? Let me know where you're watching from. The train from Denver rolled into Durango under a sky the color of old iron. Wind pushed red dust through the street and rattled the loose sign hanging outside Mercer's saloon. Men stood along the wooden boardwalk with coffee cups in their hands, waiting for something better than cattle prices to talk about. By noon, they got it. Ethan Calloway sat outside the feed store with a folded receipt in his pocket and his boot hooked against the hitching rail. He looked like a man carved out of dry timber. Tall, quiet, hard around the eyes. Folks in Durango knew better than to bother him unless money or horses were involved. Still, they watched him now. A wagon rolled slowly into town from the southern road. 2 mules pulled it through the dust while the driver kept his hat low against the wind. Then the woman stepped down. Nobody spoke at first. She wore a faded dark dress with travel dust gathered around the hem. One sleeve had been stitched by hand. Her shoes looked worn nearly through. She carried one small leather case and nothing else. Hank Mercer leaned against the saloon post and gave a low whistle. "Well," he said loud enough for half the street to hear. "Would you look at that?" Ethan Calloway really married the cursed rider. A few cowboys laughed into their cups. Ruby Carter didn't look at any of them. She stood still beside the wagon, eyes lowered beneath the brim of her hat, shoulders stiff like she expected somebody to throw a rock. Ethan walked toward her slowly. Up close, he noticed how thin she was. Not sickly, just worn down, like somebody who had spent too long surviving. "You Ruby Carter?" he asked. She nodded once. Her voice came quiet. "You Ethan Calloway?" "That's right." Another laugh came from the saloon. "Careful, Ethan," Hank called out. "Last rider who worked with her ended up dead under a burning tent." The laughter spread harder this time. Ruby's fingers tightened around the handle of her case. That was all. No anger, no defense, no explanation. Something about that bothered Ethan more than if she'd yelled back. He grabbed her bag before she could stop him. "Wagon's ready," he said flatly. They left town under 100 watching eyes. Broken Ridge Ranch sat nearly an hour north of Durango, where the land turned rough and the hills opened into long stretches of wild grass and stone. Snow rested on distant mountain peaks even in late fall. The ranch itself looked tired. Fence posts leaned crooked. One side of the barn needed new boards. Smoke crawled weakly from the chimney. Levi Calloway sat drunk on the porch rail when they arrived. He squinted at Ruby, then barked a laugh. "So that's her?" Ethan ignored him. Levi hopped down and circled the wagon. Hell of a thing. Durango's got itself a famous bride. Ruby stepped away from him immediately. Not dramatic. "Just careful." Levi noticed too. "Relax," he muttered. "I ain't gonna bite." She still didn't answer. Inside the house, Ethan showed her the small upstairs room beside the kitchen stairs. A wash basin sat near the window. One quilt folded at the foot of the bed. Nothing fancy. Ruby walked in slowly like she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch anything. "You can lock the window," Ethan said. "Wind gets bad after dark." She nodded. Again, that silence. Ethan cleared his throat. "Supper's around 6. Levi usually passes out by then." That almost sounded like a joke. Almost. Ruby's mouth moved slightly before going still again. After he left, Ethan stood outside near the horse trough, watching evenings settle over the ranch. He could hear Levi somewhere behind the barn cursing over a broken saddle strap. Then he heard it, a soft sound upstairs. Rope pulling tight. He looked toward Ruby's window. A thin piece of cord had been tied around the door handle from the inside, like she expected someone to come in during the night. Ethan stared a long moment before looking away. The cold settled fast after sundown. By midnight, the wind had sharpened enough to whistle through cracks in the barn walls. Ethan woke to shouting. "Damn horse got loose!" Levi's voice. Then came crashing wood. Ethan grabbed his coat and ran outside. Lantern lights swung wildly across the yard. One of the black mustangs had broken through its stall door, massive, wild-eyed. Foam streaked across its neck. Levi stumbled backward through the mud. The horse struck the ground inches from his head. Another kick and it would crush his ribs. "Move!" Ethan shouted. But Levi slipped. The mustang reared high above him then. A whistle. Soft, sharp, barely louder than wind. The horse froze. Every man in the barn stopped breathing. Ruby stood near the open doorway in her nightdress and boots, hair loose around her shoulders. She whistled once more. The mustang lowered slowly. Its ears twitched toward her like it recognized something nobody else could hear. Even Ethan felt cold move through his chest. Ruby took one careful step forward. The horse stopped fighting completely. Levi stared up from the mud with whiskey and fear all over his face. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Ruby looked at the horse fully for the first time, and something changed in her face. Not fear exactly, memory, pain. She backed away fast, too fast, like the sight of the animal had burned her. Before Ethan could say a word, she turned and disappeared into the dark house. The barn stayed silent except for the sound of the horse breathing. Levi slowly pushed himself upright. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Ethan looked toward the house where Ruby had vanished behind the upstairs window. A light burned in her room until nearly dawn. And for the first time since agreeing to the marriage arrangement, Ethan realized one thing clear as winter's sky. Ruby Carter wasn't just hiding from a bad reputation. She was hiding from something that still had its hands around her throat. The next morning came sharp and cold across Broken Ridge Ranch. Frost clung to the fence rails and smoke drifted slow from the kitchen chimney into the pale Colorado sky. Ethan found Ruby already awake. She stood outside near the back pasture, wearing the same faded dress from yesterday, with one of his old wool coats thrown over her shoulders. A tin coffee cup rested in her hands. She wasn't drinking it. She was watching the horses. The sunrise spread gold across the field, touching the backs of the mustangs as they moved through the frost. Ruby stood perfectly still behind the fence. Not close enough to touch them, just close enough to listen. Ethan stopped beside the water trough. "You always wake this early?" he asked. Ruby glanced toward him, startled like she hadn't heard his boots. "Couldn't sleep." Her voice sounded rough from the cold. Ethan leaned against the fence beside her. "Levy says that black mustang would crushed him last night." Ruby lowered her eyes to the coffee cup. "Maybe your brother ought to stay sober around frightened animals." That caught him off guard. Not because she was rude, because it was the first real thing she'd said since arriving. A faint breath of amusement crossed Ethan's face before disappearing again. The horses shifted in the pasture. Ruby's fingers tightened slightly around the cup.
"You scared of horses?"
he asked quietly. "No," the answer came fast, too fast. She stared toward the herd again. "I'm scared of what people do to them." Before Ethan could answer, Levi stumbled out of the barn, pulling on his coat. "You hear town already talking," he muttered. Ethan sighed. "No, they're calling her the witch bride now." Ruby's expression never changed. Levi looked almost disappointed by that. By noon, the story had spread across Durango. At Mercer's saloon, cowboys leaned over whiskey glasses, repeating the same tale. Black bride stopped a killer horse with one whistle. Some laughed. Some crossed themselves. Others started inventing details that never happened. By evening, folks were saying Ruby Carter could tame devils. Ethan hated all of it. Not because he cared what town people thought, because every time somebody looked at Ruby now, She seemed to shrink further into herself. That afternoon, Ethan rode north toward the canyon fences where winter storms had torn loose half the posts. Ruby stayed behind cleaning tack in the barn, at least. That was the plan. The horse beneath Ethan had been nervous all morning. Young bay gelding, barely broken. Halfway along the canyon trail, the animal spooked hard at a rattlesnake sliding between rocks. Everything happened fast. The horse jerked sideways. Ethan lost the saddle. Then stone slammed against his shoulder. The gelding bolted wild down the narrow ridge, dragging one stirrup leather behind him. Ethan hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. By the time he stood again, the horse was nearly gone. Then he heard another sound. Hooves. Fast. Ruby came flying down the ridge on the black mustang from the barn. Ethan froze. The horse beneath her moved like dark water over stone. No fear, no hesitation. Wind tore loose strands of her hair as she leaned low in the saddle and chased the runaway gelding straight toward the canyon edge. "Ruby!" Ethan shouted. She never looked back. The gelding veered sharply around a dead pine. Ruby pushed harder. For one terrible second, Ethan thought both horses would go over the cliff. Then Ruby stood in the stirrups and reached across. With one hand, she caught the dangling rein. The black mustang dug its hooves deep into the dirt and slid sideways through dust and rock. Everything stopped inches from the canyon drop. Silence rolled across the ridge except for the horse's breathing. Ruby sat frozen in the saddle afterward, not triumphant, not proud, just breathing hard like she'd accidentally stepped back into another life. Ethan walked toward her slowly. "You all right?" he asked. Ruby nodded once, but her hands shook against the reins. "You ride like somebody born in the saddle," he said. Something flickered behind her eyes, then vanished. "I used to work around horses," she murmured. That was all. That night, Ethan found an old leather satchel while searching the upstairs closet for spare blankets. Ruby had left it half open beneath the bed. He only meant to move it. Then he saw the paper folded inside. A poster, old creases, water damage, burn marks along one corner. Ethan unfolded it slowly beneath the lantern light. A younger Ruby stared back at him from faded ink, confident, straight-backed, one hand resting against a rearing stallion. Above the picture were the words, "Ruby Carter, the fastest black horsewoman. In the West and underneath, wanted for questioning." After the fire, Ethan stared at the paper a long time. Outside, wind pushed softly against the ranch house. Downstairs, he could hear Ruby moving around the kitchen alone. Quiet footsteps, tin dishes, the sound of somebody trying very hard not to take up space. Ethan folded the poster carefully. Now he understood why she avoided the horses, why the sound of hooves made her hands tremble, why she looked at every room like she expected flames to come through the walls. The woman the whole town laughed at had once been a legend. Ethan did not mention the poster the next morning. He folded it back into Ruby's satchel exactly the way he found it and carried on with chores like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Now when he looked at her, he no longer saw a frightened bride hiding behind silence. He saw somebody exhausted from carrying too much alone. Snow clouds hung low over Broken Ridge Ranch that week. Thin ice formed around the water pump every morning, and the horses breathed steam into the freezing dark before sunrise. Ruby had started helping him in the stables before dawn, not because Ethan asked. Because the horses trusted her. They always settled when she walked near them. Nervous colts stopped pacing. Injured mares lowered their heads into her hands. She never struck them, never yanked reins, never shouted. "Most folks break horses wrong," she said quietly one morning, while repairing a saddle strap beside the barn stove. Ethan looked up from sharpening horseshoes. "How's that?" Ruby rubbed the leather between her fingers. "Fear don't disappear just because somebody stronger pulls harder." The words hung there a while. Ethan watched the firelight move across her face. "You talking about horses?" he asked. Ruby tied off the strap without looking at him. Depends who's listening. Outside, wind rattled the loose tin roof over the feed shed. For the first time in years, the ranch felt less empty. Some mornings they drank coffee together in silence before work. Ethan would slide her a biscuit wrapped in cloth from Mrs. Grady's bakery in town. Ruby always broke it in half first, like she still expected somebody else might need the larger piece more than her. Little things began changing. Levi drank less when Ruby sat nearby. The black Mustang stopped trying to kick through its stall. Even Ethan slept better. Then Red Canyon Rodeo came to town. Posters appeared across Durango, nailed beside telegraph poles, and outside Mercer Saloon. Riders from New Mexico, Wyoming, and Kansas Territory poured into town with dust-covered wagons and loud opinions. Prize money this year was nearly $500, enough to save Broken Ridge Ranch from the overdue banknote sitting untouched in Ethan's desk drawer. Levi saw the paper first. "We ought to enter," he said over supper. "With what horse?" Ethan muttered. Levi laughed once. "The devil in your barn." Ruby stopped eating, just for a second. Ethan noticed. So did Levi. That Mustang came from Hale's old Wild West stock. Levi continued carefully. "Everybody knows it." Ruby stood from the table too fast, chair scraping hard against the floorboards. "I need air," she whispered. The screen door slapped shut behind her. Later that night, Ethan found her sitting beside the corral under a sky full of sharp winter stars. The black Mustang stood near the fence watching her quietly. "You knew that horse before?" Ethan asked. Ruby's jaw tightened. He belonged to the show. The wind carried distant piano music from town. Ethan rested both arms on the fence rail beside her. "What really happened in that fire?" Ruby stared at the horse a long time before answering. Then came pieces, not all at once. Smoke, canvas tents collapsing, men screaming, a rider trapped beneath burning beams, and Vernon Hail standing outside the flames, watching. "I told them the lantern wires were bad," Ruby said softly. Nobody listened. Her voice almost disappeared after that. "They blamed me because I survived." Ethan looked at her carefully. "You didn't start that fire." Ruby gave a tired smile that never reached her eyes. "Doesn't matter much what's true once a whole town decides otherwise." 3 days later, Red Canyon Rodeo opened beneath bitter cold skies. The arena sat beyond Durango's rail yard, where red dirt turned to frozen mud beneath hundreds of boots. Cowboys crowded the fences. Cigarette smoke drifted through the grandstands. Brass lanterns swung above the entry gate. Then the announcer called the final riding challenge. The black Mustang. Men laughed before the gate even opened. "No rider lasts 10 seconds. Horse damn near killed 2 men already." Then somebody noticed Ruby walking toward the arena. Silence spread slower this time, crueler. "Look who came back from the dead," one cowboy muttered. Another shouted, "Widow rider's back." Ruby kept walking. Her boots hit the dirt steady and calm. Ethan stood near the fence holding his breath without realizing it. Ruby reached the Mustang. The horse exploded upward. The second she touched the saddle, gasps burst through the crowd. Dust spun beneath pounding hooves. But Ruby moved with the animal instead of against it, like music remembering itself. The Mustang twisted hard beneath her. She leaned low, one hand firm on the reins, one hand loose beside her thigh. Then, suddenly, horse and rider became one dark shape flying through Red Canyon dust beneath the winter sky. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody even spoke. Ethan felt something strange tighten inside his chest as he watched her circle the arena. Not pity, not fascination. Something deeper than that. Because for the first time since his fiancée died in the snow years ago, he looked at someone and saw a future instead of a ghost. That frightened Ethan more than he cared to admit. The rodeo crowd stayed loud long after Ruby left the arena. Men who had laughed at her an hour earlier now argued over whether she was the finest rider Colorado Territory had seen in years. Ruby did not stay to hear any of it. She returned to Broken Ridge before sunset, with her coat buttoned high against the cold, and her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Ethan found the rodeo prize money folded neatly beside the kitchen lantern later that night, untouched. "You won it," he told her quietly. Ruby kept scrubbing a coffee cup at the sink. "The ranch needs it more than me." The lamp flame flickered between them. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Ethan wanted to say something honest then, something larger than thank you. But men like him were not built for easy words. So instead, he crossed the room and placed a fresh pair of leather gloves beside her on the counter. Thick winter lining, good stitching. Ruby looked down at them in surprise. "You ride with frozen hands again," he said. "You'll lose fingers by January." A small smile touched her mouth. Tiny thing, gone almost immediately. But Ethan carried it with him the rest of the night. For a little while, life at Broken Ridge felt steady. Levi repaired fence posts instead of disappearing into town. The horses settled easier. Ruby laughed once during supper when Ethan burned a pan of cornbread so badly even the ranch dogs refused it. It startled them both. Then Vernon Hail arrived. The wagon rolled into Durango near noon beneath gray skies, black wheels, gold lettering faded along the side. Hale's Great Western Wild Show. Hank Mercer spotted it first outside the saloon. By sundown, the entire town knew. Ruby heard the whispers before she saw him. She froze halfway across the general store porch, flour sack still in her arms. Vernon stepped down from the wagon wearing a dark wool coat and polished boots too clean for Durango mud. He smiled the moment he saw her, same smile from the posters, cold as wire. "Well," he said softly, "look what survived." Ruby went pale. Ethan moved beside her without thinking. Vernon's eyes shifted toward him briefly, measuring. "You must be the husband," Vernon said. "Did she tell you who made her famous?" Ruby set the flour sack down too fast. White dust burst into the cold air. "I'm not riding for you again," she said. Vernon chuckled under his breath. "You think this town suddenly loves you because of one rodeo?" People nearby pretended not to listen. But everybody listened. Vernon stepped closer. "You belong in my show, Ruby. Folks pay real money to watch tragedy ride in circles." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's enough." Vernon looked at him, then smiled wider. "She tell you about the fire?" Ruby turned away sharply, and Ethan understood immediately. Whatever hold Vernon once had on her, it was still alive. That night the wind screamed across Broken Ridge, hard enough to shake the shutters. Ruby sat awake beside the kitchen stove long after midnight, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dying fire. Ethan walked in quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without speaking. For a while, only the crackling stove filled the room. Then Ruby finally whispered. He locked them inside. Ethan looked over slowly. The riders. During the fire, her fingers trembled around the cup. He knew the tents were insured, knew the animals were insured. Everything had a price attached to it except people. Snow hissed against the roof outside. "I tried to get them out," she continued, "but the beams came down." Ethan listened without interrupting. Ruby swallowed hard. "For years, I kept thinking maybe if I'd ridden faster," yelled louder, "maybe somebody would still be alive." Ethan reached across the table carefully, not grabbing, not forcing, just resting his rough hand beside hers. "You were trying to survive," he said quietly. Ruby stared at his hand a long moment before letting her fingers touch his. Small movement, but it nearly broke him apart inside. Then came trouble. Levi stumbled into the ranch near dawn 2 days later, with blood on his sleeve and whiskey on his breath. 3 riders followed behind him. Horse traders, hard men with dusty coats and revolvers hanging low near their hips. Levi owed them money, a lot of it. "You got 30 days, one man warned Ethan near the gate. "After that, this ranch belongs to somebody else." Ruby stood on the porch listening silently. The riders left. Levi sat in the dirt afterward, staring at nothing. "I was trying to fix things," he muttered. Ethan looked exhausted more than angry. Broken Ridge was drowning from every direction now. Debt, winter, Vernon, the bank, and Ruby blamed herself for all of it. That night, Ethan woke to silence. No fire crackling, no footsteps overhead, just wind. He found the wedding ring first, resting beside the cold lantern on the kitchen table. Underneath it sat a folded letter. Ethan's hands tightened before he even opened it. By the time he finished reading, snow was already blowing sideways across the ranch yard outside. Ruby was gone, and Ethan was saddling his horse before the ink on her goodbye had fully dried. Snow hammered the ranch yard sideways beneath the lantern light. Levi tried to stop him near the gate. "You can't track anybody through this storm." Ethan pulled the saddle strap tighter beneath his horse's belly. "She left because she thinks she ruins everything she touches." The wind swallowed half his words. "But she's wrong." Then he rode out into the dark. The trail toward Black Hollow cut through narrow canyon roads, north of Durango, where old mining camps sat abandoned beneath snowdrifts and broken timber beams. Ethan followed wagon tracks where he could. The rest he followed by instinct. And Ruby, a torn piece of blue fabric caught on barbed wire near Miller's Pass. Fresh hoofprints beside frozen creek water. One burned matchstick outside an empty stable. By sunrise, Ethan saw smoke rising through the storm ahead. Black Hollow. The old mining town looked half dead beneath the snow. Lanterns glowed through saloon windows, while rough voices echoed across muddy streets packed with gamblers, drifters, and riders looking for trouble. At the center of town stood a fenced riding pit surrounded by wooden bleachers, and inside it, the black mustang, angrier than ever. Men shouted bets over whiskey bottles as snow melted against their coats. Then Ethan saw Ruby. She stood beside the holding gate wearing her old riding gloves again. Vernon Hail paced nearby with a grin stretched across his face like he already owned the whole night. "You came back after all," Vernon told her loudly enough for the crowd to hear. Folks missed their favorite ghost. Ruby ignored him. But Ethan noticed her hands, still shaking. Not from fear of the horse, from memory. Vernon leaned closer. "You ride tonight and your husband's ranch debt disappears." Ruby looked at him sharply. "That's right," Vernon said softly. "Your little cowboy brother-in-law owes dangerous people." Ethan's jaw tightened from the shadows near the gate. Vernon had planned this, every piece of it. The crowd roared suddenly as another rider got thrown hard into the dirt and stumbled away limping. Then Vernon pointed toward the arena. "Your turn." For a moment, Ruby closed her eyes. The storm wind whipped snow across the torches surrounding the pit. Somewhere nearby, piano music drifted weakly from the saloon. Then she stepped forward. Not for Vernon, not for the crowd, not even for Ethan, for herself. Ethan saw it in the way she lifted her chin before climbing the fence. The same woman who arrived in Durango, hiding behind silence, was gone now. Ruby swung onto the black mustang bareback. The horse exploded beneath her instantly. Gasps rose through the bleachers. Snow spiraled beneath pounding hooves as the mustang reared high enough to blot torchlight from the sky. But Ruby stayed centered, calm, like she belonged inside the storm itself. Then the horse ran, fast enough to blur. The crowd went silent, watching her cut through snow and smoke beneath the red canyon cliffs surrounding Black Hollow. Ethan felt his chest tighten painfully, not because he feared losing her, because he finally understood how hard she had fought just to keep living. Then chaos broke loose. An older man shoved through the crowd near the saloon porch, yelling, "Hail started the fire!" Heads turned instantly. The man pointed straight at Vernon. "I worked the backstage lanterns that year." Hail locked the riders inside after the show ended. Murmurs exploded across the bleachers. Vernon's face changed. Cold panic. He reached for his revolver. Everything happened fast after that. One of Vernon's hired men fired first toward Ethan near the fence. Levi appeared out of nowhere and slammed into his brother hard enough to knock him sideways into the snow. The gunshot cracked through the canyon air. Levi collapsed beside Ethan. For one terrible second, the whole world stopped moving. Levi. Snow gathered in Levi's hair while he struggled to breathe. "It ain't bad," he muttered weakly. "Just don't let her leave again." Men rushed Vernon from every side as the crowd finally turned on him. Somebody knocked the revolver from his hand. Another dragged him through the mud, while people shouted about the fire, the dead riders, the lies. But Ethan barely saw any of it, because Ruby was already beside him in the snow. Levi managed a crooked grin, seeing both of them there together. "Knew you two were stubborn," he whispered. Months later, spring finally reached Broken Ridge Ranch. Snow melted down the hillsides in silver streams. Fence posts dried beneath warm sunlight. Young horses filled the fields again. And every morning riders came to the ranch. Young cowboys, widows, children too frightened to touch reins. Ruby taught them patiently beneath the Colorado sky. Never yelling, never breaking spirits, just listening. The people of Durango stopped calling the cursed rider after a while. Now they called her something else. The woman who could calm any horse in the West. One quiet morning, Ethan leaned against the ranch fence holding a cup of black coffee while dawn spread gold across the mountains. Ruby rode the black mustang through the open field beyond him, snowmelt splashing beneath the horse's hooves. No crowd, no shouting, no fear, just wind moving softly through the grass. Ruby looked toward Ethan as she slowed near the fence, and Ethan smiled at the woman the whole West once laughed at. The woman who became a legend anyway. Some folks spend their whole lives trying to outrun what hurt them. Others bury it so deep they forget what their own heart sounds like. But every now and then, life puts somebody beside you who sees the wound before they see the shame. Somebody who stays when leaving would been easier. Maybe that's what this story was really about. Not horses, not rodeos, not the old scars people carried across the frontier. Maybe it was about finding one person who reminds you that your worst day does not get to decide your whole future. And if you've ever felt like Ruby, misunderstood, exhausted, carrying something heavy nobody else could see, then maybe you understand why Ethan kept riding through that storm. Because sometimes love is not loud. Sometimes it looks like a man waiting quietly beside a fence at sunrise, or a woman finally believing she deserves peace. Out in the West, the wind erased most people's footprints sooner or later. But kindness, loyalty, the way somebody made you feel seen when the world turned cold, that stays. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you're watching from, or which moment you felt the deepest. And if you'd like, stay a little longer on this trail with me. There are still more forgotten towns, wounded hearts, and quiet miracles waiting just beyond the next firelight.